and I forgot my pencil.
Clarity, you need a snack.
No, ma'am?
It appears that the class is always hungry and I didn't want to distract them.
Okay.
May someone let me borrow?
Well, do me a favor, let's
Hey.
return our seats so we can get started. All right, we have a guest speaker today. His name is going to be announced in a second. He is an ordained elder, elder of the United Methodist Church here in town. He is currently asking Charles to sit down. He is currently pursuing his Doctor of Ministry in Biblical Interpretation and Proclamation from Emory University. He holds a Master of Divinity from Emory University. He holds a Master of Education and Counseling from James Madison University. And he also has his Bachelor of Arts in History from Berry College. Ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Ted Goshorn. That's right.
The introduction.
That's right, I apologize for it.
You're fine. I don't know if I've ever had quite this kind of introduction before. I feel very welcome, so, and a little embarrassed. It's good to be with you.
May I interrupt just for a
Yeah.
second? Will you be wanting to use this?
Maybe.
Okay, I will get rid of this. Would you be wanting to play anything?
Maybe.
Okay, well,
To kind of see how things go.
I'll jump when you say jump.
Okay, I appreciate it.
No problem. Do you mind if I record?
Do you mind if I what?
Do you
Oh,
mind if
no,
I-
you're fine.
Okay.
Oh, I see. Hi. I'll wave at the camera.
There you go.
In particular, I was asked to talk about history and connect that to music. Is that still correct?
Yes, the Middle Ages in particular.
The Middle Ages in particular. And to talk about the Middle Ages, I want to tell you a story about a dumpster fire. Y'all familiar with dumpster fires? Yeah, usually those are bad things, right? So my wife and I, we get a dog right after we get married, and we decide to go for a walk with this dog. This dog is 40 to 50 pounds, pulls like this. We take her to obedience school, and it never changes. Just pulls like so. Anyway, we're walking around our neighborhood in Macon. We lived in downtown Macon, very hilly place. We're on top of the second tallest hill in Macon, and we're walking up and down the hills. Well, I run into our trash dumpster. Somebody had stolen our trash dumpster. Nerd that I am, I knew what the serial number was on our trash dumpster. Because I looked at the dumpster so much, I just remembered the number. So, and yes, I'm quite the nerd. So, I'm like, that's our dumpster. So I hand the dog to my wife. My wife is 8 months pregnant with our first child at this point. And she's about yay tall. So I hand this 50-pound dog, it pulls like this, to my very pregnant wife, and I say, wait, I'm going to go run the dumpster up the hill back to the house. So that's what I do. Well, I get to the house, and I'm going to put it up against the side of the house where I usually put it, and I discover it's full of ants. So I think to myself, remember this is a plastic trash dumpster like you use at your house, right? Standard plastic trash dumpster. I think to myself, what kills ants? Anybody?
Ant spray.
Ant spray, I don't have any of that.
Rain.
Gasoline, see this is where my head went. I said fire. So I go into the garage, I come out with lighter fluid that I use for my charcoal grill. I douse the inside of this very plastic trash dumpster with lighter fluid. I light a match, I throw it in, the thing goes whoosh. And I'm kind of feeling very masculine, like I have made fire. And I'm very excited. And then I look down at my feet. I had the foresight to put the dumpster on the sidewalk, but this thing had a hole in the bottom I didn't know about. And the lighter fluid had run out through the hole into my grass. And what does fire do with lighter fluid? It follows the lighter fluid. So I look down, my grass is on fire. So I run around the side of the house, I grab my garden hose, I come running back around the side of the house, and there's my very pregnant wife holding our 50-pound dog going, "What are you doing?" Because I hadn't even had a chance to put any fire out yet. So I put the fire out, but the point of the story is, that's history. We create dumpster fires, somebody comes along and says, "What are you doing?" Makes things right for a little while until the next dumpster fire happens. And in between, somebody writes music about it. Somebody says, they write the music to talk about how stupid I was for causing the dumpster fire, right, to make fun of me. Or they write music to thank God that my wife came around the corner and was the voice of reason. Or they write music to commemorate the event. The other reason I share that is that the Middle Ages is basically one huge dumpster fire. There's not a lot of great things to point to. So, and here's the deal that I'm going to make with you. I can ramble and I can talk and I can tell you all sorts of things. A, if you get confused, I want you to tell me. B, I like dialogue. I don't like lecturing so much. I'm a preacher, which might sound kind of funny. But I would write sermons all day long and never deliver them. So I much prefer to go back and forth. So if you have questions or you want me to talk more about something, or if I've talked at length about something and you're totally bored with it, then tell me that too. And because I want you to walk away feeling like you have a good grasp of the Middle Ages. So, that make sense? All right. Pop quiz. When did the Middle Ages start?
I had a lot.
I told.
450.
I love it. Yes. Now I was going to say no wrong answers, but you hit the right answer. So yeah, gold star. So about 450, 451-ish. Here's why. What happened? Anybody? It was a dumpster fire, a particular kind. There was literally fire. Rome got sacked. Right? So these big hairy beasts of men come running out of northern Europe, down the Italian peninsula, and destroy Rome. And I say big hairy beasts of men because that's what they were. Northern Europe was this wilderness land of nothing, with nomadic tribes that just kind of made a subsistence living. And if I start to use words you don't know the meaning of too, let me know. I'm famous for doing that. So. And so they run down the Italian peninsula and they set fire to Rome. Now, why is that important? Because Rome was the big, powerful, hey, how's it going? I am not Bob. Yeah, I just want to make sure that was clear. So Rome is the big, powerful empire of its day. And this marks the end of Rome, which is a huge deal. What that means is that Rome doesn't have any influence anymore to keep things stable. One of the things that I remind people a lot when we're talking about history at church is that the world, we don't think of the world this way because we live in America, but if you didn't live in the big bad empire of whatever day in the world history you lived in, the world was an incredibly dangerous place to live. Because there was always somebody who was showing up at your house trying to burn it down, stealing your crops or your cattle or whatever it was that you kept, raping your daughters and wives. It was constant. But if you lived inside the borders of a big bad empire like Rome, you didn't have to worry about that. So if Rome doesn't exist anymore, there's nobody to protect people anywhere in what used to be the Roman Empire. So, that's why I said the Middle Ages is kind of a massive dumpster fire. Because there are constantly people powers going back and forth trying to control land that used to be controlled by Rome. So what happens, and let's fast forward a while, is the Bishop of Rome goes by what other name?
Pope.
The Pope. Very good. Yes, gold stars over here. So the Pope, by the year 1000, is known as the Pope. And because there is no secular, what does secular mean?
Non-religious.
Yeah, basically just not of religion. There's no secular authority that is big, bad, and powerful in Western Europe. The Pope is the one that's really in charge. Also, the Pope has all the money. So kings, France, different parts of Germany, Italy, Great Britain, Spain, those kings are going to the Pope saying, hey, lend me some money so I can raise an army, so I can go, if you're the Spanish king, so I can go kill a bunch of those stupid French people, right? And the Pope's like, well, what are you going to do for me? And they work out some sort of deal. And then the Pope loans the king money. And then the way the king pays the Pope back is the king goes and hopefully, if he's successful, destroys a bunch of French cities, steals all the gold from those French cities, and then brings it back to the Pope. Here's the interesting thing about that. Where in the ancient world was the money stored in a town? The answer is not a bank.
In the church.
In the church. The church was the bank. So the Pope is saying to the king, here's some money so you can go destroy some of my churches, the Pope's churches in France, so you can take my money and give it, so take their money, even though it's in my church, and give it to me. So I pastor First Methodist right here, right? That'd be the equivalent of me saying to some people that go to my church, hey, you know that Oak Grove Methodist over there down near Rhine? I'm going to pay you some money to go down there, burn that church down, steal all their wealth, and give it to me. Even though we're both Methodist churches. And I have some responsibility for that church. That's kind of crazy, right? Again, Middle Ages is kind of a dumpster fire. So, the reason this connects to music is this. The Pope eventually gets really frustrated that Christians don't control the Middle East. Now, I'll save you all the gory details of this, but about 400 years, by the year 600, the Prophet Muhammad founds the religion Islam. They found a what they call a caliphate, which you may have heard that word in relation to ISIS. But way back then, the word caliphate was just the Islamic word for kingdom. The way we use the word kingdom for a king, a caliphate was run by a shah, or, which you may have heard that word before, or a sultan, kind of like an Aladdin, right? So the caliphate grows, again, Rome is no more, right? So the caliphate takes over the Middle East and North Africa, the other parts of what used to be the Roman Empire, which includes Jerusalem. And the Pope decides he's very concerned that Christians don't control sacred holy sites like the tomb where Jesus was supposedly buried and rose from the dead, the hillside that was supposedly Gethsemane where Jesus was crucified, or Golgotha, where the garden, Gethsemane, was supposedly located, the little cave that in Bethlehem, outside Bethlehem, where Jesus was supposedly born. Because again, we don't know that any of those sites are actually where any of those things happened, but tradition says that that's where we think they happened. And the Muslims control all of that. So the Pope says, aha, here's what I'm going to do. First, Christianity was a pacifist religion for the first 1,000 years. You know what pacifist means? It means Christians were adamantly anti-war. For the first 1,000 years of Christianity, Christians said, war is never the answer. Which kind of sounds very different than today, right? So for 1,000 years, that was again, I'm Methodist, Christian, that was our theology. The Pope says, we're going to have to change that. Part of what he does is commission some new music to help inspire people to go off and fight a holy war, which the Pope whole cloth invents the idea of a holy war. Uses scripture to justify it, but invents the idea. So the Pope says, all ye nobles who would come and help me take back the Middle East, come to Rome. I will give you my blessing. In fact, and this might sound like something else you've heard of that's not Christian, if you die in battle, you will get rewarded in heaven based on the number of Muslims you kill. What does that remind you of? Sounds like radical Islam, doesn't it? The way we talk about it today? That, say, people who fight for ISIS or people who fight for Al-Qaeda, part of what they believe is the more infidels they kill, the greater their reward when they get to heaven. So, Christianity is doing this 1,000 years ago, yeah.
I heard something one time that was like, if you don't do anything like sexual in your life, then whenever you get to heaven, there will be like a lot. I think they said like a lot of virgins or whatever. Have you ever heard of that?
Is it like, she's talking about like, don't it say something about like being a, is it like something about being a virgin when you get married? Or, cause Mary was a virgin until
Yeah.
Jesus, so.
So that was part of it, yeah. And that is, I think, as I understand it, a belief of very extreme Muslims. I want to emphasize very extreme because there's a lot of wonderful Muslims in the world. And they get caricatured to an unfair stereotype, to an unfair extent. So, let me throw this away. And that is based on a misinterpretation of the Quran.
What is the
that-
Quran?
The Bible of Islam. Just like I would say the Pope was misinterpreting scriptures in the Bible to justify a holy war. For example, 2 weeks ago I preached Psalm 149. Psalm 149 verse 6 says, the praise of God, the praise of the faithful, or the faithful shall praise God with their mouths and hold a two-edged sword in their hands. And in case you're wondering, what does this mean? That the psalm then goes on to say, so that they can go and strike down the faithless. And then it starts to name some of those people. So you could read that if you really want to, and say that God is saying, the faithful way to worship me, Christian God, right? The faithful way to worship me is to praise me and then grab a sword and go strike down some people who don't believe in me. Now, I don't know that any of us would say that that's a true statement, because you're misinterpreting what that psalm is about. So people have done that with the Quran, they've done it with the Jewish Bible, which is what we would call the Old Testament. Christians have done it forever. So the Pope gets people by saying you're going to get blessings in heaven, you can keep a lot of the wealth you find, but I want you to bring some of that wealth back. Great will your reward be if you go and recapture Jerusalem. And then he commissions music to rouse the people in churches to come and support the Crusades. So the Pope is successful in this and gets nobles who come to Rome, get the blessing, or just go to their local bishop and get the blessing, raise up an army, and march, literally walk, most of them, from, if you know your geography, walk from, say, Italy, modern-day Switzerland, Germany, France, to Jerusalem. It's a long, long way. And when they get there, they are successful initially, but they don't have the supply chain to hold on to Jerusalem. And there's a lot of war, there's a lot of destruction. In the process, what the Muslims had done, the Caliphate had done, was at that time, Muslim theology, and still a lot of Muslim theology says, if you're a person of the book, which means a Jew or a Christian, then then we are going to treat you differently, because we think that you don't quite have the full gospel, full good news that we know as Muslims, but you're close. So we're going to treat you differently than, say, a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Taoist or something like that. So when they conquered Jerusalem, when the Muslims conquered Jerusalem, they preserved all these holy sites for Christians. And Christians could come and visit, and they loved that, and they might try to be like, now just add the Prophet Muhammad to what you already believe. But they'd let them come visit. And Christians have been going and making pilgrimages all the time the Muslims own Jerusalem for that. The Christians, when they show up to recapture Jerusalem, destroy a bunch of these holy sites. Mostly on accident, but they end up getting destroyed, kind of not accomplishing what the Pope had wanted to see accomplished in the first place. The That's the dumpster fire piece, right? And then after they do this 4 times, including sending a bunch of children to Jerusalem, trying to say, well, surely they won't kill children, they'll just let them walk right in and take over the place, which, they did kill the children. They eventually, a new pope comes to the throne in Rome and says, like my wife, what are you doing? And they stop the Crusades. And the dumpster fire is over. But it becomes reason for music to be written. Music that commemorates conquest, as well as music that calls the church foolish for ever embarking in that direction. So that is where a lot of the birth of music comes from to a good extent. It was based off of early Christian worship services didn't have any music, which might sound strange thinking about, if you go to church or if you've been to church, you sing hymns. Well, that was nothing like that in the earliest church services that met in houses. And those church services were very different. There was a lot of chanting. And if you want to know what chanting sounds like, imagine rap music without the beat. Imagine hip hop without a beat or any kind of instrumentation behind it, and you're kind of close. If you've ever been to an Episcopal worship service where a cantor chants a psalm, then you know what I'm talking about, but I don't know that any of you would have ever heard that. The Pope Gregory eventually picks up on this chanting, and makes it, how many of you have heard of Gregorian chant, or was that in your textbook?
We are just about to jump both feet into that. You are introducing this
Cool.
whole area.
So, one of the things that, let me back up. And this is again in response to the fall of Rome. One of the ways people look for stability is they start to found monasteries. And including the most famous would be Benedict, Saint Benedict. So they found monasteries, and the monasteries are the primary center of, what do you think?
Where or what?
The primary center for a town of, the answer is not prayer, but you might think it would be. Monasteries provide stability because they're the primary source of commerce. So your local farmers market is at the monastery. They are the primary source of funds, because they're the bank. Usually the church is inside the monastery that you go to for services. They are the primary source of beer and wine. And you drink a lot of beer and wine because most of the time you can't drink the water without getting sick. So the way you stay hydrated is you drink beer and wine. Now before you go back and you start downing a 6-pack saying to keep yourself hydrated, beer back then was much less potent. So it'd be more like going and buying O'Doul's than buying Bud Light. Because you're talking about maybe 1% alcohol instead of 4.5 to 7% alcohol like modern beer is. And wine too tended to be a little bit less potent, although wine back then was sometimes even more potent than it is today. 20-30% alcohol instead of 12 to 15. So anyway, this is your primary source of hydration, your primary source of money, your primary source of food through the farmer's market, your primary source of worship as well. And these monks start chanting the Psalms. Pope Gregory comes out of a monastery, because he was a monk, and he introduces that across the Catholic Church. And then music becomes part of worship services at that point. From there, now get this. Back then, the thought was, if you're gonna sing in church, you can't have any instruments. Instruments are tools of the devil. So it can only be monks going, da 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 da. You ever see Monty Python?
I showed him a small clip, The Black Knight,
Okay,
to try and get them mentally, okay, we're still on horses and spears.
gotcha. So in Monty Python, The Quest for the Holy Grail, there are some monks that walk through town and going, da 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 requiem, and they bang themselves in the head with a stone. If you forget the banging the head in the stone, what I just sang sounds a whole lot like Gregorian chant. They're making fun of it, but that's what music sounded like. Sounds kind of crappy, doesn't it? So at some point, somebody was like, this sounds kind of crappy. We should put some instruments with this music, which caused much controversy, but eventually the instruments won out. That led to, at the same time, kind of, the formation of choirs, which now is a big deal in churches, right? Like churches have choirs. But where was the choir in these ancient churches? It's still this way in Catholic churches and a lot of Episcopal churches.
Above everybody.
And in the back, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you hear the choir, you're sitting in your pew, and you hear the choir start singing, it's coming from back here. And that was because, hey, welcome back.
Thanks.
So many people were so concerned that music would lead people astray that they said, well, if we're going to have choirs and they're going to sound pretty, we're going to put them in the back where nobody can see them, so it reminds them of what the heavenly host must sound like while they're praising God up in heaven. It wasn't until about 200 years ago that choirs got moved to the front. So that's a pretty, think about Christianity is 2,000 years old. 200 years ago is a pretty recent development in Christianity. So choirs get formed because there are some people that say, instruments are evil, but we can make this music sound prettier. So they form the choir to sound angelic and put them in the back. And then, now we're about the year 1400 or so, somebody said, well, why don't we put the pretty sounding choir with some instruments? And at that point, there's less resistance because 400 years of history has proven that instruments don't lead people to the devil. Surprise, surprise, right? So, at that point, you start to get some of the stuff that you've probably heard of. Bach. How many of you have heard of Johann Sebastian Bach? And Bach's big thing was the, what? What instrument did he primarily play?
The piano.
Close. Not the piano.
Oregon.
Organ, yeah, he primarily played the organ. The organ was this newfangled invention they started putting in churches 500 years ago. And comes to us from Germany, I think, right?
Yes, sir. Can I put my class on the test? What piece by Bach did we study?
Little Pig and G9.
Boom. Okay.
Look at that.
Do you know why we listened to it? Anybody?
To hear the
Monotony.
Not monophony, but polyphony.
Who? Philophily?
Polyphony.
Philophily.
Okay, I don't know what that word means. What's
It
that
makes
word?
multiple melodies.
Oh, very good. I gotta say, I learned something new. And so, this is, again, a lot of this music is being written. They'll say it's for the glory of God, etc. And I think for a lot of them, they were writing for the glory of God. That there was a religious fervor attached to their writing. But it was also because the church is the center of life for the community. The church is the place of stability. The church is where you go to get everything you need. Because the church is usually part of a monastery or it's close by. The church has the money. The church has the food a lot of times, farmers markets and all that. And so the church wants you to continue to support it because it needs you to in order to keep surviving. And so they want to keep you happy, and so they come up with new music. And then you keep coming in. Now again, this is different than modern day, because if you're in this town, if you move here, and you're like, where am I going to go to church? You've got like 1,024 Baptist options, and a Methodist church, and then some other, the Assembly of God church down the Cochran Highway, and then a few other churches you can pick from. So you've got the AME, CME, etc. If you grew up in one of these towns we're talking about in Europe, you had how many options? One. There was just the church. But if I'm a local farmer and I'm like, why do I need to keep paying this church money so I can sell my crops at the farmer's market? Why don't I just, my farm's not far from town, why don't I just start selling my crops at my farm, and I'm gonna get my neighbor farms, these friends of mine, to come and sell their crops on my land too, and I'm gonna charge them a lot less than what the church charges. There are some people that tried this. So this is an enterprising thing, right? In our society, capitalist that we are, we'd be like, yeah, that's great, you go. That's what we do, right? We figure out how to cut the competition. And the church in this case is the competition. Well, the church doesn't want that, and they don't live in a capitalist society. So the church wants to keep you happy, wants to keep you attached, wants to keep you subservient so that you don't question whether or not you should be paying them these taxes and fees to sell your goods at the market, or whether or not you should be paying them interest on the loans you take out from them. Which is an interesting point because according to the Catholic Church, there are 7 deadly sins, right? One of the 7 is usury. Anybody know what that means? It means charging interest on loans. It is a mortal sin in the Catholic Church to charge interest on loans. But the churches are doing it all the time. So, churches are charging interest on loans. Churches are keeping people subservient. Churches are charging them taxes. Churches are dominating the landscape. Is it any wonder that Martin Luther got so pissed off at them? You know who Martin Luther is, right? The founder of the Reformation. How many of you are Protestant of some kind? Means that you are not Catholic, if you are Christian. Right, so you're Protestant. You are a product of Martin Luther. Because Martin Luther was a monk in the Catholic Church. And Martin Luther was like, it's not right that you're charging interest on loans because that's a mortal sin. It's not right that you're doing all the things that I was just talking about. So he nails his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg in Germany and says, you're on note. Any of y'all watch the Colbert Report? I love the Colbert Report. Stephen Colbert, like from the Late Show with the Colbert Report. He had this on notice board. And so it was meaningless and stupid, but if somebody did something dumb, he put them on notice and slide their name on the board. Martin Luther is putting the Catholic Church on notice by putting these things on the board. His expectation naively is that the Catholic Church is going to say, oh, we're so wrong, sorry about that, we're going to reform. That's not what they did. They tried to kill Martin Luther, that didn't work. They excommunicated him, and so when they excommunicated him, Luther said, well, I'm going to found my own church. And so from the Lutherans came the Presbyterians. From the Presbyterians came the Baptists, and so on and so forth. So what that does is, for music, when you went to church prior to Martin Luther, do you think you sang when you were in the pews? No. Because what language was Mass in? Worship service. Everything. Latin. Do you think if you lived in middle of nowhere, East Podunk, Germany, let me rephrase. Do you think if you lived in the Eastman of Germany that you spoke Latin? Absolutely not. Nobody besides the priests and the bishops and the monks spoke Latin. So you don't know what the crap's going on when you go to worship. And there's no expectation that you're going to join in the singing because you can't sing the language. In fact, here's a fun story. When the priest would get up to do communion, right? So y'all are the congregation, right? And I'm the priest. And it's time for communion. And the table's behind me, the altar table, with the wine and the bread. So what I do is I go like this. I put my hands up and I say the prayer in Latin. And at some point, I get to this phrase, hoc est, now I'm not going to remember it, hoc est in, I don't know if I can do it well. There's something, hoc est in hodum something. And then a bell rings. And you know when the bell rings that the bread has just become the body of Christ. Because that's Catholic theology, that the bread when the right prayer is said, literally turns into the body of Christ. So you're literally eating Christ's body when you go take communion at the Catholic Church, still to this day. But they hear the priest going, hoc est in potum whatever, and then the bell rings, and like, oh, that's magic. But of course, I'm facing this way, so I'm muffled. And do you think there's modern day amplification equipment? No. So you're relying upon the acoustics of the church or the cathedral to get your voice back to the people, but they don't speak Latin anyway, so what the people hear is not hoc est in potum whatever, they hear hocus pocus. And so they start going around saying hocus pocus, thinking that those are the magic words that make God do magical things, and that's where hocus pocus comes from. So one of the things that Martin Luther says is, screw all this Latin nonsense, we're going to have church in whatever language the people in the village speak. So in Martin Luther's case, that's German. So that means that now people can start singing. So they start singing, they take the bar songs, like, right, they go Friday night, they go to the local tavern, they get drunk, and they're like, blah, 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 blah. So they know those tunes, so they take those tunes back to their churches, and then they put Jesus words with them. And so, for example, do you know the hymn, what is it called? A Mighty Fortress is Our God, right? I'm not a very good singer, so I won't sing it for you. That was a drunken bar song, and then Martin Luther wrote the words, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. And that's what we sing now. Excuse me, the people, because they want to sing, they want to participate in worship. And from that, somebody says, oh, we should write this stuff down. And so they write the music down with the words, and you get what? What is a book full of music in a church? A hymnal. So that's where hymnals come from, is that the people say, we want to be able to continue to do this. And a whole new branch of music is then opened up. Because now there's a market for people to write hymns that people can sing. And not only that, but they'll write the music as well. So, I mean, to this day, there's a lot of old bar tunes that are still in hymnals, but then there's also beautiful music that's been written for the purposes of singing hymns. They go with the particular hymn. It's kind of like the tune for our national anthem was a drunken bar song that Francis Scott Key wrote the words, and then it got put up against whatever, I forget the name of the tune, but it was, if you were an American patriot and you just beat the British, you go over and you start going, da 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 da, and who knows what words you were singing. It certainly wasn't Francis Scott Key's, because it was a drunken bar song. So that whole, it really opens a whole new avenue for music in churches, because they are no longer bound by the Catholic Church, and so they're free to reinvent how that happens. Am I getting too far into modern history?
No, but you're blowing me away. So Gregory did not have the church keep records of the chants?
Oh, he did, yes. I should have mentioned that. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the beginning of written music.
Okay.
Gregory having the church keep record of the chants. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
I was becoming unstable there. Okay. So what Martin Luther did basically was make religion and the music relatable to the people, understandable.
Accessible to the masses.
Understandable, yeah. Even today, a lot of Catholic services are done in Latin, yes?
No, I wouldn't say a lot. I think most of them are now
Okay,
in the local language.
let's change that. Even during my lifetime, yeah. So it's recent that
1964-ish.
where they
something like
started
that.
changing.
Yeah.
Okay.
My mom grew up Catholic and remembers suddenly understanding what was going on when the priest started speaking English. So, yeah.
Okay. I'll hush now. Go ahead.
That's all right.
You're doing great.
Well, let me pause just to say, what questions do you have, or what do you want me to go back and talk more about, or?
I wanted to ask you, when you were talking, you kept referring to the Pope.
Mm-hmm.
many different people were pope, but the office of pope is what you were describing, right? As far as its political gains and
Yeah.
everything.
Absolutely.
Okay, 'cause
Different
this-
popes acted differently, but
Because
yes,
this is over years and years and years.
lots of time, yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
And you just now used the word Catholic for the first time.
Yeah.
What is the distinction between the church and Catholic, Roman Catholic, or whatever?
That's a good question. And briefly, I'll say, for 1,000 years, there was no distinction. There was just the church. It was one unified church with just a couple of tiny exceptions, like in Egypt. So nobody had to say what kind of church you went to, because you just went to the church. And like I said earlier, there was one church per town, typically. Excuse me, when, about the time of the Crusades, the bishop in Rome, the Pope, and the bishop in Constantinople get mad at each other for a whole host of reasons, most of them political and financial. But the way that the conversation is discussed is about a theological debate of whether or not, and this is going to get real technical in a hurry, so I'm not going to bother you with a whole lot of the gory details unless you really want them. Whether or not in the Trinity the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father or from the Father and the Son. See, it gets real technical in a hurry, right? I mean, I'm a well-trained theologian, and part of me wants to be like, who cares? But for them, this was a huge deal. So the bishop in Constantinople, which modern city is Constantinople? It was Byzantium under the Romans. The change to Constantinople under Emperor Constantine. It is now, it's in Turkey. What's the largest city in Turkey?
What's
I
it
feel
start
like I
with?
feel like I should know this.
What is it?
Starts with an I.
Istanbul?
Istanbul, yeah. Istanbul is the modern name for Constantinople. So the bishop in Constantinople gets angry with the bishop in Rome, and eventually they split. This is the first split in Christianity. It happens in the year 1067-ish. And from that, you get the Roman Catholic Church, Roman from Rome, where the Vatican is. And on the other side, you get the Orthodox Church. So how many of you have heard of like the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Armenian Orthodox? That's all that side of Christianity. There's a Greek Orthodox, if you drive to McRae, I know I'm not saying McRae, it's like McRae or something like that. But if you drive to McRae, right before you get to, it's not Helena, is it? It's Helena. Helena?
It's Helena and not Macrae, it's Mugcrae.
McRae. All right, see, I'm still looking. All right. I grew up in Rome, Georgia. We just called it Rome, right? But I could pronounce all the little towns around there the way they did. Anyway, all right, so Helena, correct? Yes, okay, good. Right before you get there, there's a little Greek Orthodox church off on the right near the Georgia State Patrol office. So that's an example of that side of Christianity. There are more Orthodox than there are Protestants, right? Because there's three main divisions of Christianity: Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant. And Catholics have about 1 billion. The Orthodox have, I want to say, like 700-800 million. And then Protestants don't even come close to that number. I don't know what it is, 200 million, something like that. So the Orthodox Church splits off. It kind of goes its own way. Here's a fun fact. Instead of a pope, do you know what they call? The guy's name is Theodore right now, which is actually my first name. I go by Ted, but my real first name is Theodore. So, but they don't call him Pope Theodore. What do they call him? Do you know? He lives in Istanbul because that's still the seat of the main guy that runs the Orthodox Church. Call him a primate, which I think is kind of funny because it makes me think of monkeys. So, Primate Theodore is what they call him. So then, the Protestant church is born 500 years later out of by Martin Luther, and we just covered that a second ago. And unlike the Orthodox Church, and unlike the Catholic Church, the Protestant church fractures into a million different denominations. So it starts with Lutheran, then it goes to what's broadly called Reformed theology from John Calvin, and that gives birth to your Baptists and your Presbyterians. Those are the big ones from that branch. And then there's a guy named Zwingli, whose name is fun to say, from Switzerland, who is like, I like what Luther's doing, I like what Calvin's doing, but I want to do it a little differently. And from him come the Anabaptists, which is not to be confused with Southern Baptists, very different. The Anabaptists are the parents of the Mennonites and the Amish, which you may have heard of. Where I went to school in Virginia, there was a major Mennonite university nearby, and Mennonites can range. They don't all drive carriages with horses and all wear black like the Amish do. That's a different story. So, and then King Henry VIII sees what's happening in Germany and says, well, I keep wanting to divorce this woman Catherine that I stupidly married, and the Pope won't let me. But if I do what Luther's doing and found my own church, I can divorce her all that I want. And then this girl I'm sleeping with, Anne Boleyn, I can marry her. Right? Remember King Henry VIII has like 8 wives and kills half of them? So this is the beginning of that. So King Henry VIII founds his own church called the what? It's pretty easy. Church of England. And the Church of England, when people are coming over to the New World to found British colonies, they put a Church of England in the middle of town, right? So, you've been to Savannah? And they got the beautiful squares. And off of one of those squares is Christ Episcopal Church, which you may or may not know of. That's the site where the Church of England church was. Because every town in America had a Church of England church. When the Revolution happened, you can't have Church of England churches in America because the head of the Church of England is who? The king, right? Queen Elizabeth is the head of the Church of England. So King George III, you don't want to have him to have any relationship to this country, so those churches of England are like, crap, what do we do? And they eventually form into the modern denomination that you've heard of. Anybody know? The Episcopal Church. So the Episcopal Church is the Church of England in America, essentially. But I want to be clear though, the Church of England has no allegiance to Queen Elizabeth. The Episcopal Church has no allegiance to the Queen of England. So while this is happening, John Wesley goes, Church of England's kind of dead. I want to make it better. And he founds the Methodists. Quite by accident, kind of. He never meant to form his own denomination, but I'll spare you the details, they just kind of worked out that way. And the Methodist Church, when it was founded in 1784, was vehemently anti-slavery. But that changed over time. So Richard Allen was a pastor, black pastor in Maryland in the Methodist Church, and he wanted to be ordained. And the bishop wouldn't let him because he was black. And so Richard Allen said, well, I'm going to go found my own church. And that's the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME, which is still around. And then when the Civil War ended, the Methodist Church, the white Methodist Church said, well, we don't have slaves anymore, so we can't make them go to our churches, which is what was happening. Because in most Southern churches, if you have a balcony in the back and it's an old building, what was that balcony for? Not the choir. The slaves, right? If you go into a church building in the South that predates the Civil War and it's got a balcony in the back, that's where the slaves sat. So the white folks are like, well, we don't have anywhere to we can't force our slaves to go to church with us anymore, so we're gonna build them their own churches that they can go to. At least the Methodists did this. And that's where the CME, today known as the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, its original name was the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. That's where that denomination comes from. Have you been to Macon? I'm sure you've all been to Macon, right? You ever notice there are 2 First Baptist churches? You ever notice that? There's a giant Catholic cathedral, right? And then, so if the cathedral's here facing this way, there's a First Baptist right here, there's a First Baptist over here. This First Baptist was the original First Baptist of Macon. And after the Civil War, they did the same thing, except the white people in that church said, we're gonna go up the hill and build us a new church. And that became First Baptist Church of Christ. And then they left their old building to their former slaves, and that became just First Baptist Church. And those churches still exist, and they are still predominantly white and predominantly black, although both pastors have done a good job of starting to reconcile their congregations, which is a pretty neat story. I'd encourage you to go look up. They have a combined youth group now. They do a lot of combined services, a lot of combined programs. It's a neat thing. So anyway, that's a long story of where we get all these different denominations from. And I'll use that to segue to say that church music eventually gives birth to modern music. Anybody know how? All right, so you got two different strands. First, you've got standard music. When you think about like classical music, right? And it's got a very defined rhythm. You can count it out, right? So Bach is a good example of that. We talked about Bach earlier. So eventually some people write just music in that vein. If you think about, well, I can't think of a good example off the top of my head. But there's just some pop songs that come from that. Excuse me. So, and pop music starts to happen when, during the Industrial Revolution, because people start to gather in bars, but they want to hear bands, and so the bands come in and they play. But the big innovation is jazz. Now, jazz doesn't come from classical music. Where does jazz come from? Comes from African American spirituals. It comes out of the black church music culture. It comes ultimately from the slave fields. Because the rhythms that were invented or brought over from Africa and then used in those fields to teach these spirituals eventually gave rise to jazz. And one of the things that's fascinating about those spirituals is, how many of you know Wade in the Water? All right. Do you know the symbolism of Wade in the Water? The chorus is wade in the water, children, wade in the water. Gods are going to trouble the water. See that man all dressed in what? One of the verses is black, right? See that man all dressed in black? And I can't remember what the next thing says. But it's a warning, because most of the time, if you were a runaway slave, the people looking for you to capture you and bring you back to slavery are wearing black or dark colors, because it's usually at night, and they want to blend into the forest. So, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's going to trouble the water. If you got in the water, you threw off your scent, so the dogs they had chasing you couldn't find you. It's code to teach you how to escape from the dogs they sent, because that's the primary tool that slave masters would use to recapture their slaves, was dogs. So then, see that man all dressed in red, looks like the band that Moses led? Moses is code for Harriet Tubman. And the Underground Railroad workers would wear something red. So if, while you're escaping, you run into somebody, white or black, who's wearing red, then you could go up and say, something to the effect of, do you know Moses? They're like, yeah, let me take you to her. And you knew that you were under the care of the Underground Railroad at that point. So most of African American spirituals that predate the Civil War have some sort of coded language in them that you'd be in the slave fields working, singing these songs, and they were teaching you how to escape. So that's a fun, I guess fun's probably the wrong word, very interesting aside about those spirituals. But they were sung with the kind of rhythm that jazz has, which is different from a standard metronomic beat, right? Because it's got a swing beat. So at some point, the 1920s, some folks start to combine that pop music with the jazz beat, or the swing beat, and you get jazz. And jazz coincided with the rise of drinking in society. Because it was more readily available. Whiskey was a nice new invention. And people would go to speakeasies and bars or whatever, and they'd drink and they'd listen to jazz music. And so you had the right incubator to give rise to this kind of music. And then jazz is the parent of what kind of music? Elvis kind of founded it. Rock and roll. Because it carries that beat from jazz. And then from rock and roll, we get anything else you can think of. And all of it, the fact that it's written down, the fact that it is, it has a beat to it, all of it can really be traced back to that Gregorian chant that's kind of close to where we started. All right, I came full circle.
Oh, I'm impressed. What time is it, anybody? I didn't ask if
I'll be
that.
signing at like 12:30.
Ma'am,
12:22.
12:22. We're gonna take a break.
Mm-hmm.
I'll talk to you. You're not in trouble. And it's 12:22, 12:45. We'll pick back up. 12:22.
So does that mean like a quarter to 12:45?
Yeah.
You mean 12:45?
We'll be back at 12:45.